Well, this interview is going to be awesome. We have Jacques Vallée joining us. Katie, you are joining us from a different location in the States today.
I am. I'm clear on the East Coast in Maryland, so
Yeah.
happy I can join. I didn't want to miss this for anything, so
I
I packed the equipment and everything. I'm gonna
I
be
don't blame you. I would have done the exact same thing, but it's actually quite a big, I don't know, room that you're in. It's quite spacious.
echo, echo,
Yeah,
echo.
exactly. If
Welcome to
anybody
the
jumps
East
in, we
Coast.
get to see it. And Michael, actually, this is the first time for both of you guys to meet Jacques Vallée. What questions on your mind do you think you're going to ask him?
It is. I have several here, but I think the one I really want to get to is questions about like his spirituality and how a lifetime of studying these things has affected his view of the world and like how to do life. That's the one that's kind of pressing me the most. As much as I also want to ask lots and lots of questions directly about UFOs.
Yeah. And Katie, I don't know anybody as busy as you are, as well traveled as you are on a weekly basis that does this kind of research besides Jacques Vallée. What is the questions you would like to ask him?
Well, first of all, I want to thank him because he's just tore down walls and he's battled and he has, there's just so many. But one of the sleeper movies I love is Witness of Another World with Juan and his encounter in the 70s, which personally for me hit home like I'm crying and his work in that. So I want to ask him just about like the personal side of the phenomenon, how, because I know he's a caring person and you can tell he's really connected to a lot of these witnesses. So I kind of want to get into that with him a little bit.
You know what always scares me about Jacques is how intelligent he is. His IQ must be super high, but he's always so nice spoken. It's like he never makes you feel like you're the idiot in the room. He just makes you feel like you're part of it, right? And I appreciate that as a dumb person. I appreciate when somebody elevates me. But yeah, seriously, he's awesome. I cannot think of a bigger legend. And I told you guys this previously, but as a French Canadian kid, I was into UFOs and mocked. But I knew that Jacques Vallée was this really well-renowned French dude. Because of the movie Close Encounters, which was
Mhm.
based on him. So it was kind of like a role model for me in my late teen years. And I can't think of anybody else that's been as influential as he because he's never stated absolutes. You know, he
Right.
would go investigate no matter how much evidence he has, suspend your judgment, which I have a hard time doing. I don't know about you guys, but the fact that he's able to do that after this many years, that's impressive.
Yeah, he balances the science with, the other. I mean, he walks that line. That's hard to do, and he's the best
He's
at
Yeah.
a
that.
role model for how to think well, I think.
Think well,
Yeah. Because I think
live
most of us
well.
just want to jump in the pool and we'll accept everything and everything's amalgamated. Like it's all just one big theory where he's like, no, let's look at it on an individual basis, which that's what we need to do. Can't learn from somebody better than that, right?
All
Awesome,
right.
guys. We'll be right back with Jacques Vallée. Hang tight after this quick announcement from our sponsors.
Are you paying attention?
Well, as if you needed another reason to listen to UAP Studies podcast, we have Jacques Vallée joining us today. Jacques, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You know, I have one of my favorite stories of having a guest on is you. Because the first time you came on, I wasn't paying for the Zoom feature that allows you to record for up to an hour. So they won't only allow me for 40 minutes. I believe it was you and Paula Harris came on the podcast the first time. Paula had to leave, so it was just you and I. And I saw the clock run down. It was telling me you have 1 minute left, and you were like really flowing with your conversation. And I was sweating. I'm like, oh no, what's going to happen? And then it just shut off, and you disappeared. And I went, I called you up right away. I'm like, no, I'll send you another link. That's one of my favorite stories. That's
And now the rest of the story.
now the rest of the story comes out. No, we are really honored for you to join us. Of course, guys, today we're going to talk about Jacques' newest book, Forbidden Science 6, and its scattered castles. One thing that I personally liked about this is that it is your journal, and you show a lot of vulnerability about your personal life, things that you went through, your struggles, death, grievance, and all that. But it's intermixed with your UFO life, which my hat's off to you. The fact that you could differentiate your personal life from your professional life is amazing, especially with everything you've gone through. So,
When of course, I studied in France, and I came to Texas to work in astronomy. And then I met Dr. Hynek, and then I met more and more people. And then in California, I got to meet and work with, some of the some of the people who guided me through the internet research and so on, and some of the pioneers. And I got to know them. And if I had studied the field with just books, I would never have known why they did the research they did, what they went through, and even now there are so many myths about the internet and the web and how all that happened. And this is within living memory. I mean, I could, introduce you to some of these people. They are still alive. They are still working. And I think preserving the personalities and preserving the conflicts. Science doesn't just emerge, like they tell us in class. There will be a test on Tuesday, on who developed quantum mechanics. Well, yes, guess again. And it's people are losing as as the frontier moves, in this research. Now it's all in Washington, and which senator is going to talk about which case and so on. But then we follow, the history is getting forgotten more and more. Like, nobody talks about the Socorro case and what came from it, or the Valensol case and what came from it. And those were cases that were studied by several agencies of governments. This is not just hearsay. This is not just somebody telling a story in a bar. And now, from the point of view of the people looking at it now, everything looks the same. It's just one story after the other that they've seen on TV. Well, we need to go back to reality. We need to go back to how this was investigated. Who did what, and how did we learn? And so that's what I'm trying to do.
So important. I mean, your book, it's so personal in some areas and very vulnerable. And I love that you're opening that for discussion. And there's a film, Witness of Another World with Juan from the 1970s. And speaking of historical cases, can we talk about the 1970s? I know selfishly I bring that up because of my own experiences in the 1970s, but Juan is a really good example in that film on how it touches people so personally. And I think that's overlooked a lot, the experiencers. And can you talk about, the people that you've worked with through the decades and how it is such a personal journey for people?
Well, I've been looking for opportunities to do this, to revisit cases that have been studied before. And because, things change, of course, people change, the recollection is important and so on. And I had met Juan when he was 14. And, shortly after his experience, there was a group in Argentina, a remarkable group, that had organized a series of lectures around the country, 5 5 towns, 5 cities. And I had said, okay, let's do that, but I don't want to do it, if it's Tuesday, it must be Buenos Aires, let's take the time. I'd like to meet people, and I'd like to know about the cases in the area. So they agreed to spend an extra day in each of the 5 places. And we were this particular case happened in the north of Argentina. Argentina is a huge country; it's the size of Europe. We forget that Brazil is the size of the United States, and and Argentina is the size of Europe. And we we met Juan and had the first first chance to hear the story when it was still fresh, and we had some of the local investigators with us. And of course, my first wife, Janine, who was a child psychologist, was delighted to be there because she could interview the kid and some of the kids who went to school with him, who knew him. And his school teacher was there at the big lunch that they organized for our group. And this was just so wonderful, and I never forgot that case. And having the opportunity to go back and meet him again, 34 years later, was extraordinary. And they were going to make a movie about UFOs as legendary material, as poetic license, so on. And I told them, look, this is not poetic license. I mean, there is a science component here. This is part of, there are lots of people who have had that kind of experience. We're just fortunate to have a case that's extremely rich with knowing, having a lot about the environment that we could know. And I said, instead of coming to interview me in San Francisco about the case, let me go back to Argentina and see him again. And they thought that would be interesting for the movie, and of course, getting into into more of how the experience had changed him and whether it happened again. And we found out that, yes, it did happen again. And they had missed all that. I mean, none of that was part of, the retrospective of that one case. And I took 6 months before going there to relearn. I was fluent in Spanish when I was a kid. When I was 15, I went to Spain and so on. So I was fluent in Spain Spanish, which is not the same not quite the same as Latin America, especially Argentina. So I relearned enough Spanish because I wanted to speak to him one-on-one. We had a great rapport, because the first time we were there, even his parents didn't know whether they could trust him. I mean, a 14-year-old kid can make up stories, and to get the depth of it by looking at his entire life was extraordinary. But I wanted to have those meetings, man to man, in his language, and that was, of course, profound experience for both of us, because there were things that we had shared at the time that we could pick up from that experience, after all those years. Fortunately, both of his parents were still alive, so it was reconnecting with the family, and it was a lot of fun. Actually, we were joking. I was one time I was talking to his father, and his father had a felt hat, which was on one of the pictures I had taken, 40 years before. And I said, Senor, es el mismo sombrero. It's the same hat. And we both laughed. And it was, those kinds of things. That's why, people have to go into the field and meet the people and understand the human depth of the experience and, how it changes families, how it changes communities. I think that's what people in Washington have no idea about this. No idea.
Yeah, the long-term effects of what happens to a person after a sighting. And a lot of people just take the story for what it is. They don't understand that it changes the person fundamentally going forward. And this phenomenon is not only physical at times, but it's also spiritual at times, which is really weird. Michael.
Yeah. So I've got four questions I really hope I can get to, but we'll see how the conversation goes. But the very first one comes because I was having a conversation with a friend about synchronicities in our lives. And he was mentioning that he had had a series of synchronicities. He's a philosopher and had become acquainted with a new author that he was sort of enamored with and had bought several of her books. And synchronicities, I think, led up to him buying them. And then we were also talking about how I was going to get to interview you. And he said, "Oh, well, I just got Jacques' new book." And we turned to the introduction, and there at the end of the introduction, you mentioned the very author that he had just become enamored with, who is Isabella Eberhard. And you give her the final word in the introduction to your book, which I can read. You say from Eberhard, "Only the tomb can take this richness from me, and who can tell? If fate gives me time to recreate a few fragments, perhaps it will live on in the minds of others." And I wondered if you could just talk about why you begin with Eberhard, and what significance she has in your thought, and if there was a some deeper reason other than that passage was touching to you.
Well, I was struck by what she did, and of course, the way she wrote was unique. She was an example of a woman on her own traveling in the world and reporting on what she had experienced. And, so she was very much a pioneer in that movement. And she inspired women's movement at the time, but at the same time, she had, I think, the same attitude towards discovering people and discovering the world and discovering sort of the hidden little things that teach you something about yourself, And that's what touched me in her writing. And and of course her poetry and the way I was, touched by the way she died. She drowned in a desert. Well, how can you drown in a desert? Well,
Flash flood, right?
When it does rain, it
It
creates a
pours.
torrent, and the torrent becomes a flood, and the flood will eradicate, will change everything in the landscape. And she was caught in one of those floods and drowned. And so she had a life. It was so dramatic, and at the same time, what she was writing was so poignant, so powerful that I wanted to, maybe in a small way honor, her experiences, because we don't need to go into the world anymore. We can just look at TV, or we can look at reports from things, and that's wrong. I think we need to go back to people like her, and she went off by herself, to all those places.
And just as a man, so that she could have access to sort of like Sufi teachings and things. Like she's an incredibly brave person.
Yes.
What do you think she would think of the weird work that we're all trying to do, this subject?
Eberhard, you mean?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I, um, Well, she was very close to people, and this comes from people. It doesn't come, yes, it comes from F-18s equipped with extraordinary cameras and everything else. But, even with the F-18, you need to sit down, have a cup of coffee or a beer with the pilot, and then you're going to hear a different story than what they testify before Congress. So I've had been fortunate to have that kind of experience a few times, and I think she would capture, the personal side of it, the emotional side of it, because sometimes the emotions drive the testimony. I've mentioned often the case in Northern California of two now retired miners. A couple had a little claim, 5 hours north of San Francisco. California is a really big, big state, and their sighting had been reported in the San Francisco Chronicle, and it said that they had seen an object 3 times on their claim, on their property, and then he had a ufologist had gone there to to capture the report, and they told him that the object had left vertically, from where it was. So I go there, and they give me a cup of coffee, and we talk, and we talk about their family. The woman, her parents were French. At least her mother was French, and so we talk about that, and we joke and so on, and then I say, by the way, can we go to the site? Can we go to the place? So they take me to that little place within the trees, and I said, tell me, how did it go off? And they said it went off at an angle. Well, if it goes off at an angle, it has to go through the trees, and those are big trees. Those are the big California, pine. And they said, well, it kind of went through the trees. And I say, well, that's not what's in the paper, from San Francisco. They said, well, the man who came, he was in a hurry, and he was such a nice guy. We couldn't tell him it went through the trees, so we told him it went up. Well, I took a day to go there. It takes 5 hours of driving every way, and but that was important. It's important in terms of the physics. I mean, what kind of craft goes through trees?
Yeah.
It's now we're worrying now about things that go through the water and out of the water into the air, back in the water, and so on. But going through solid things, that's not the same kind of physics.
Indeed.
And it blows my mind that these things could go not only in space, the atmosphere, our skies, water underneath the ground. Some people have seen them go into mountains. And
Yes.
even here, I have a mountain that I could see from my house called Sumas Mountain. And it is always active with UFOs. I don't know why. I bet you there's a base in there. I don't know why. But we saw the 3 orbs once right by that mountain, and that blew my mind. And people keep seeing things One gentleman was driving the highway right next to the mountain, and there was a green ball that came right above the car, shut the whole car off as he's driving, and it went directly into the mountain. So I'm like, ugh, that is cool. But it freaks me out because you can't stop something like if we pick a war with these guys, Jacques, which I'm always worried about with these clandestine groups, that if they pick a war or do something bad, they're speaking on behalf of all of us. They're making decisions on behalf of all of us, which we don't know. Every day they make decisions that could end the world, and we don't know. Was
Um, there are a lot of things, and the subject of what's classified and so on keeps coming up in all the discussions now. But the things are secret at many different levels. And the secrecy that we talk about is, the kind of clearance that I had and that the whole team had during the Bass project of Mr. Bigelow, which was, and that's what the testimony before Congress touched on a lot of that and so on. And of course, by now, some of the things we did are no longer classified, and some of it is still classified. All the computer stuff is essentially still classified for, justifiable reasons. But there are a lot of things that we don't talk about because they've remained under the surface, and you get in some ways you get brought in when you bump into the story, and then you realize that there are things that witnesses don't talk about until they trust you, and they are not going to trust you just because you show up for a couple of hours with a tape recorder. They have to know that you care. And that's another kind of secret. And those are the secrets that, as you know, I've had secrets like that I've been telling in these books, because by now it really doesn't matter. But that's the level where we have to go if we want to understand the process.
well said. Katie, back to you.
So speaking of NIDS and these high strangeness locations, I know that I think it was in the 80s you spent time at the Mount Wilson Ranch.
Yes.
Can you speak a bit about what your team was trying to discover there? And what connections, if any, did you make to the Skinwalker Ranch to the Mount Wilson Ranch?
Um, we were looking for, Mr. Bigelow knows that, of course, the area very well, and he had the insight that there might be, again, that as you said, the Skinwalker Ranch was not unique, and we knew that there were cases in that other area. So, that involved Dr. Puthoff, and it involved some physicists who were with us and so on. And we wanted to get and one idea that we had on the board. This was NIDS at the time, so this was privately. This was not a government thing. This was just our group under Mr. Bigelow, and the idea was that if we could find another place, another ranch, that we could use as comparison. In science, you don't just do one experiment. If an experiment works, you redo it in different places with the same thing in medicine. A drug that works for women in Patagonia may not work for men in Kansas. Okay, so you have to look for different environments to see to what extent what you think you've discovered is really true, or if it's true everywhere. So we were looking for that. There were cases in the area. They were not as well um, as well studied, of course, as the one at the Utah ranch. The and to my knowledge, it wasn't followed up to a great extent. Uh, but it was a lovely visit. There was a lot of the early Americana, early. I mean, it was a Western. It was used as a Western site by Hollywood. There was an old hotel there that was haunted of all things. So we spent some time interviewing people about the ghost. So it was, it was a great experience, but it didn't emerge as, sort of a twin story with the ranch in Utah.
Yeah. It's interesting that it's so close to Area 51 and has that Howard Hughes connection. So it is an interesting place on its
Yes,
own right. Yeah. So, all right. Thank you for
everything in
that.
that area has Howard Hughes connection.
That's true.
Um, so a question I want to ask is I'm pretty new to the UAP subject. I've only been into it for about 5 years or so. I came from academia, um, and one of the things that I've been trying to do for the past 5 years is kind of suss out the like space of theories that might possibly explain what's going on. And the extraterrestrial hypothesis seems to dominate that space, but you, among a few other people, have introduced other much more interesting, or at least philosophically interesting theories to me. Yours, I think, being this idea that there's some kind of like recursive metaphysical control system that's manifesting strangeness for various various reasons. Another theory, though, that I have become increasingly interested in and want to get your thoughts on, or that's become increasingly plausible to me, is the idea that there's been some small group of people doing what we would call really basic science research, but under a completely different paradigm than Western science, and that they may have made breakthroughs that they don't have any incentive to share with the rest of the world. Right. This is something like the breakaway civilization hypothesis, and this has become kind of plausible to me because I started reading medieval and like late antiquity alchemists and seeing that they have a very plausible worldview and that they were actually doing productive science. And I can imagine that in a non-capitalist system, you could make really important breakthroughs and not turn them into a product and sell and disseminate it to the rest of the world. Do you think, as you're reflecting on your experience in this field, that there's like what likelihood would you assign to that kind of explanation that some of this might be a group of people who are operating according to non-state, totally private interests, and they've made some leap in scientific research that we just don't even have the concepts for?
Well, it's a lovely concept because it can be so dramatic. I mean, it can engage it's the stuff of great movies and great novels. And Jules Verne, Captain Nemo uh, didn't ask the government for funding, to build a Nautilus. So that happens in science. There's a man in France who got the Nobel Prize at the end of World War II. And he was asked by journalists, that this was a war, when you did that research, and you were alone, you were cut off from everything else. There were no congresses, there was no, the physics people didn't go to conferences because there was war everywhere. And how could you do this work that earned you the Nobel Prize? And he said, that's it. It's because I was alone. And I didn't know what my colleagues were working on, what were the great ideas that were getting all the money. And there was a couple of things that I had always thought about that should be investigated in the lab, and my lab was working. He was in the south of France, which was not occupied at the time. So life went on at some reduced pace, and he did that research, and it was, it was breakthrough research by himself, and that happens, even here in San Francisco. I mean, the discovery of prions. There is a doctor at the hospital here who came up with the theory of prions, and everybody laughed. And he did the research alone, not hiding from anybody, but nobody would give any money to do the research. And it turned out into a Nobel Prize in medicine. So that happens in science, and modern science is big science, big cyclotrons, the size of a country, in Europe, that cyclotron that goes under the French border, from Switzerland and circles the whole area. And of course, the same thing in this country. And that's where all the money goes. But I worked at Stanford in astrophysics with Professor Sturrock, who was, as you know, very interested in UFOs and organized a number of conferences and started the Journal for Scientific Exploration. And all the work we were doing we were paid, by the National Science Foundation and so on, to do the research, but it was essentially paper, equations on paper, and then turning the equations into computer programs that we ran. So yes, we paid for the computer time, but that was, it was peanuts compared to a cyclotron the size of two countries, So we often talk about that, what are we doing here? I mean, and this was breakthrough research on the structure of the sun, the structure of the corona of the sun, the physics of pulsars. Those were big problems in astrophysics. But essentially, the contract or the grant paid our salaries and the computer time. And, lots of paper and pencils. So, and nobody knew really what we were doing. And you could go through a university like Stanford, has this enormous campus. You would find people in offices, certainly at Stanford Research Institute, the same thing. People working on things that nobody has ever heard about. And they will tell you, well, it's not really important now, but under certain circumstances, it could be breakthrough science. And then people will need to know what we're doing here. So that's always existed in science, not just with alchemy. I mean, the alchemists were forced to hide because of the religious aspect. Okay. And now, many professors, physicists interested in UFOs have to hide from their students even, and certainly from their colleagues, because, if you say you're interested in UFOs, well, you may not be invited to the next Congress on relativity and so on. So I think that has to stop. I think that we need to open the doors and the windows and so on, like as Dr. Nolan is doing, Dr. Puthoff and so on, who are, pioneers in getting all that out. Having said that, could there be a cabal, or could there be just a project of a few people doing absolutely breakthrough research? I mean, we don't really know how hard it is to go into another universe. Maybe there's a simple way to do it, and we just haven't discovered it. I mean, so much of physics is by accident. the Andromeda Nebula was discovered not because of the people who got the prizes, but because there was a young guy at Mount Palomar, uh, who was the guy who was developing the plates and that kind of thing, and did the, preparatory work on the telescope, on observing nights and so on. And he became, by studying by himself in that environment, he became a very, very good astronomer. But he was still regarded as a technician when he noticed that, there were those strange structures on the plates from Palomar. And where before people thought there was just, a clump of smoke of something in the sky. And that was the Andromeda Nebula. And, if you don't have people like that, very often, the big discoveries are made by accident. X-rays, discovery of that X-rays could fog photographic plates. Again, that was, an assistant who discovered that. It wasn't discovered by Madame Curie. Curie got 2 Nobel Prizes, but she got it for other things. But the discovery of radioactivity was an accident. So, yes, those teams can exist in a closed space and do really good science. As you know, I've been fascinated by the history of science and the history of chemistry through alchemy. Well, we forget how much we owe to the Arabs. Alchemy, and so many things in science and in astronomy. The name of so many stars starts with Al, which was the Arabic designation, because that's where the science comes from. Well, what else was there? What else did they discover? So now we don't care about, taking lead and transforming it into gold, because we can do that in particle accelerators, so we don't need the alchemy anymore. But tell me again, what was that formula that gave you gold out of lead? I mentioned, and there's a photograph in my book, of the people who are quietly doing alchemy in France, and they showed us a prototype of the alchemical transformation to make gold, and they're still, they claim they know how to do it. So those things can happen, but the one of the things I do in my work in venture capital occasionally, I've been on the board of a number of companies in Silicon Valley, and you may have the job of hiring the next CEO for the company when the company gets to a transition. And I've interviewed a lot of people for CEO positions and so on. One of them told me about, this was for a medical company, pharmaceutical company, and he told me about the discovery of a drug that had significant properties in terms of sexual function, and that this came out sort of accidentally out of the research they were doing. And he described to me, he was in the basement with the lab, and they were testing 500 different molecules for a particular condition in the body that could be a medication for an illness. And then they discovered, and nothing worked. But then they discovered that in some of the testing, there were some people who had taken the medication and reported some really strange, after effects when they
This
were
is
in bed.
Viagra, isn't it?
And they started studying this, thinking it's a fluke, it's not. And he described what happened as he was a chemist, essentially looking at these molecules. When they discovered this, this type of medication, this class of medications, and then they gave him a team of 10 chemists, and then they tested it. They brought in doctors. Then they brought in, test subjects. Then it became a whole department. And then he was essentially watching this becoming one of the major, when they realized how much money the company could make out of that one accidental discovery down in the basement. So he described to me, he was still shaken by how his job had gone through 10 different levels, in 2 or 3 years until the drug was approved and until the drug could be in the market. So, yes, you can have projects like that that are completely underground. The funding, is not reported anywhere. It's just part of what you spend on research. And you have that team working on something that can really make a difference. And that's throughout science. I think it's throughout the big university, you would find projects like that.
Was it Viagra?
Yeah.
They were hard at work.
Yes. but
Couldn't help
there is
myself.
a whole class. After that, you discover it turns into a branch of science because there is a whole class. I mean, what else can it do?
One of the things that you talk about, we're going to get into the Lone Stars because we need to talk about this group. I did not know that the Lone Stars existed. And so we'll definitely, we'll get into that shortly. But you mentioned Colm Kelleher. He emailed you
Yes.
an email about these weird cryptids. And supposedly there was evidence or DNA evidence, 17, I think, cases, 2 from Canada, 15 from the States. And the DNA came back in mostly human. So I was wondering, maybe you could expand on that. Like, what is the theory right now behind these cryptids? And if they're human DNA, are they from us or are they manufactured?
So that would take us in an area of science where I don't have a mastery of even the real basic concepts, because that's where we are, there. I mean, the work that Dr. Keller is doing is, it is very much at the frontier. He's published a couple of papers that are not in the UFO archives, but are in biology. And also looking where some of these illnesses that manifested in cattle, where that came from. And I was fortunate to, to be a friend of his and a colleague of his, having, followed his early research on that, going back to the research on prions and research on all that. And it's absolutely, groundbreaking research. And the problem is there you immediately touch on politics and you touch on markets. I mean, the food markets across the world,
Right.
and and how the information has to be formulated for the public so that, number one, people don't panic. Number two, they know how that there is research going on. And then harnessing the resources for the research to go through the right, but there are now, we're faced with, when I talked to Dr. Nolan, and, we're done with COVID, but COVID is an example of a class of medical situations that will continue in different forms. I mean, it's not just, one bad accident in a lab or one accident in transmission of a virus or of a condition, but it's a class of things in nature that are evolving as our environment changes. I mean, it's fine to say that that there is no increase in temperature and so on. But whatever the reason for the increase in temperature, I can tell you in France, now there are invasions of insects that were never seen in France, that come from North Africa and from other places in the world that are much warmer than even the south of France. So, nature is changing. And I think that that research, breakthrough discovery is often not secret, but it's often in a small area, and it can be killed by a number of things. Somebody stops your budget because they think it's never going to work. Somebody can't follow the theory, like prions. Prions are very weird. I mean, why should the molecule do something different? If it's like this, it's good. If it's like that, it kills you. And why? And those are fundamental processes that we just bump into as science grows.
Well said. I'm freaked out because I believe in werewolves now because I keep hearing about these tall wolves that are hunting people, especially after the visiting Skinwalker. So I'm a big werewolf fan, so I'm really happy about that. Katie, go ahead.
Well, speaking of cryptids, I think the field, Jacques, owes you a huge shout out of gratitude because in this world, as investigators and researchers, things tend to be compartmentalized. And I feel you're one of the first people to really break down those walls and take a look at cryptids and their spirituality side and the personal side and the paranormal side. And that's huge because and the science is very important too. And I think you recognize the importance of all these. And I want to ask you, lately, I've come to believe that we as humans, our consciousness plays a big role in the phenomena itself, that we can interact with the phenomena and perhaps even create that, people that claim to call them in, Chris Bledsoe, for example, who can bring them down. Can you speak a little bit about your beliefs in the consciousness piece of the phenomena?
Yes, and that would bring us also to something Michael said earlier about synchronicity. He mentioned the word, but we didn't really get into it. And it's, thanks for giving me credit for those things, but I've had very good teachers. I grew up in France at a time where there was the opportunity to look at things outside of the normal, because nothing was normal. I mean, I was born in a German, essentially a German colony in a German country, and I witnessed the liberation of France and so on. The town where I was born was bombed 17 times. And so when I grew up, I didn't have a sense of what is, normal things that you have to do, because it was wide open. And I knew that things could change very quickly. And what we're seeing today, I mean, is, certainly the United States and the rest of the world changing radically. And we're entering an era that's somewhat, similar. And I think it's an era also where breakthroughs are possible, but we have to. It's one more reason to be disciplined in the way we do the research. And fortunately, I've had the privilege of working again with people like Colm Keller, people like Dr. Puthoff, people like Dr. Green, and as you know, people in France who were, the true invisible college, underneath all that, as Dr. Hynek said. So I've had very, very good masters and very good colleagues who've encouraged me to do that, and a few synchronicities along the way. I mean, things that were just complete surprises out of nowhere. When the fact that I was at SRI when Ingo Swann came to SRI to work with Puthoff and Tag on their project and so on. I mean, those were coincidences which were extraordinary, and but you have to put yourself in a particular, open mind situation to let that, to notice that, to notice it and to let it happen. And to work with it. It's dangerous because you don't know where it leads. You don't know what's behind it. And I think at where I am now after all those years, we cannot violate what science. Yes, there are examples of bad science all around us, of things that people claim as science, which is really just technology. But just technology has given us Silicon Valley, and there is science at the bottom somewhere. Okay. Somebody had to do the first experiment. And so we can never forget that. And we have to accept the process that science has to, and that's what we've done, with Dr. Nolan. I mean, we've done that analysis of a piece of something we're pretty sure comes from a UFO because we have the witnesses, we know who they are, and this is not woo-woo, mysterious stuff. We have the names of all the witnesses, 12 witnesses in the space of an hour. We know who they are. We can go back to them. We know where they were. We have the picture of the material when it was still melting, in the grass. Pictures that the firemen took, and we have a testimony of the policemen who were there, and their interview. So we have all that, but it took 4 years to get the paper accepted. People say, "Why don't you publish it?" Yeah, well, we can put it on the web tomorrow, but nobody's going to read it. I mean, the people, the physicists at Stanford are not going to stop to read that. Why should they? So there are standards, and those standards have to be followed so that you don't go off in a direction that's fictitious.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So the problem is that interface between the two, having the somewhat rigid standards of science and working under that, bringing things into the lab, but then you have to invent the process in the lab, because you don't know what that is. It could blow up, it could be deadly, it could be. So we know it's not radioactive. We've tested it and so on before we bring it to the lab, but you still don't know what it's going to. And in the one we've published, and we're going to publish others, we knew at the end of the day, we knew the thing was not unusual in terms of the structure of the atoms. But what was it doing there? I mean, if you had a flying saucer, flying device, why would you carry molten steel? You know,
Where did
and
that
why
event?
would you need to dump it?
Where did that event happen again? Where was that?
That was in near Omaha,
Oh, okay.
in a suburb of Omaha. There were these people were when some of our witnesses were just driving through the town, and they saw an object, a circular object with lights going around the circle, and then the object flew off. In the process, half a ton, I think 400 kilograms of molten steel fell on a levee in a park just outside Omaha,
1,000 pounds,
in a
half a
town
ton.
called Council Bluffs, which is actually in the next state, in Nebraska. But
Wow.
the people saw it fall, and there were flames in the grass around it because it was melted metal. They called the firemen. The firemen stopped the little fire. There was no problem. And then they called the police because they thought, some accident must have happened. And we know, and that story never made it to the UFO journals. It wasn't, and it was reported. It was in the local papers, but nobody picked it up. Well, I picked it up because I heard of it, and I contacted some of the people who had done the investigation the next day and had been part of the interviews and everything else. And they sent me part of the steel, and they sent me the Polaroids from the police, and then I gathered recordings of everything else, including the results of the analysis. And then Dr. Nolan and I took it to the lab. And he redid the analysis and went to the isotope analysis with two different types of instruments. And we published it not as a UFO story, but we published it as a science development story. As really as what do you do as an experimental process when something completely out of the ordinary happens and is brought into the lab.
Was any
But
Was this recent?
it took 4 years.
Yeah. Was this recent, this event?
No. It goes back 40 years.
Oh, 40 years. Okay.
Nice.
But I
Michael.
had saved everything. I have a few others
Was
that
any
I,
prosaic
that
explanation?
I want to talk about eventually. But the science is hard. You have to find scientists who devote the time. There is going to be no funding. I mean, you have to do it with no money. I think money ruins a lot of good science because the people giving you money have some idea of what they want to find, or what they want you to find, and in some cases they are very open-minded, and it's great. We had the privilege of working with Mr. Bigelow, who was open to all the possibilities. But in many cases, that gives you, it boxes you in, and you can't do that.
Was
So
any
it's like,
prosaic explanation offered for that case?
No,
Yeah.
no. There were some interesting exchanges with the Strategic Air Command because they had a B-52 that flew over the town about the time, going to their base, and they got the joke, and they said, "Look, we carry nuclear weapons, but we don't carry molten steel,
Yeah.
and we certainly don't dump it on the suburbs of Omaha." So, but actually, what struck me in reading all the correspondence and all the exchanges with the Air Force and with the different labs and so on, with, of course, the companies that made steel in the area were contacted, and they participated in the analysis in their own lab. And what struck me was how seriously everybody took it, including the Air Force. And the Air Force got interested because there had been a crash at a Soviet satellite in the northern part of America, of the continent, and they didn't know where the thing had fallen. And they thought, oh, maybe it fell, near Omaha. So they were very interested in recovering the Soviet satellite because they suspected the Russians to use radioactive substances in their satellites in violation of a few agreements we had signed with them not to do that. So they became part of the study. And there they are in a UFO research study. And this was not the component that was looking for UFOs. I mean, these were the people who were looking at the atomic guidelines and everything else. And then they said, it's not us, and the analysis doesn't match what we're looking for. Then they came back because they were still looking for that satellite, and finally they found it in Nevada and in Canada, and they went to recover it, and that was the end of their interest. But they were involved in documenting the analysis, all the way along. And you have a picture of what can happen when everybody collaborates to try to solve a real mystery. But we had 12 witnesses. It wasn't the case of, somebody came by the next day and he knew the cattleman who knew the doctor who had done this and so on. This wasn't it. We had the names and professions and ages of all the witnesses within an hour.
Wow.
There's no mystery.
So if it was a
that's
trial,
what you need if you're going to come before the Academy and stand up with a very unusual case.
yeah.
They'll say, how do you know that somebody didn't? I mean, some of the witnesses were young kids, students. They were in their late teens. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe they got some. Well, they looked at that. Where would they find, half a ton of molten steel and dump it without being noticed in the middle of a park, in the middle of a city? So everybody looked at the hoax possibility from different sides.
I'm curious because of all your years of investigating. You've had amazing cases. Some turned out to be nothing. Some turned out to be amazing. This is going to be not a trick question, but it's going to be tough for you because you got many cases to choose from. Which is your top case that you think is the most credible? And which one do you think is the least credible that has no legs to stand on?
In the book I wrote with Paula Harris, about Trinity, the Trinity case is still in question because even though we believe the witnesses, we don't know what that object was. I mean, it was, it matches everything we know about UFOs and so on, but there are certain circumstances that we haven't been able to elucidate completely. And as you know, we've now found more witnesses, and so we know it happened. Okay, we know it happened. We know they're not lying, but does that mean that it's the same category? So this is, a key case that opens up a lot of things, but we're still searching. In the book Trinity, I talk about two other cases, the case in Valençol in France and the case in Socorro in New Mexico. those two cases were investigated by multiple agencies of governments and their scientists. Okay, not to say that cases that are investigated by MUFON or CUFOS and so on have less validity because they bring in scientists too. But those cases were sort of national investigations by police, by customs, by intelligence agencies, and by experts in different disciplines from the sites around it. And in that book, in Trinity, I brought in testimony that had never been published before about Socorro. There were still some questions. There are still people around, some skeptics, and legitimately they've raised questions about Socorro. Could it be a balloon? Well, when you read Trinity, you go into, 1/3 of the book is about Socorro, and we nailed it. And I had documents that came from other archives that read onto all the testimony that was gathered at Socorro and just nails it. We know it was all the things that people say. The case in Valençol, there is finally a movie, French, movie about the case of Valençol. I went to Valençol a couple of times, and I spent 3 days with the main witness when he was still alive. And I'm one of two people that he trusted, three people that he trusted, two that were still alive, one is dead, that he trusted with things that he didn't report, that he didn't tell the police, because he thought they had no business knowing about it. We were talking about witnesses and how they are touched personally by something. But those witnesses were exceptional, and so you could go very far with it. I could give you a list of 5 or 6 cases like that you could take to the Academy. Roswell is not one of them. Roswell is very interesting. It's profound. It's something we need to continue to investigate. Everything about it is relevant, but there was no witness.
You bring up history, and you bring up the Socorro case and Lonnie Zamora and how important that case is, not only to you, but to J. Allen Hynek as well. That kind of was the case that turned him around. And just recently, we acquired, or David Marler's UFO Historical Record Center in Rio Rancho acquired the original APRO files. So we opened up the 1967 Snippy the Horse case in the San Luis Valley, and come to find out, Don Richmond, who was a APRO investigator, actually went down and compared. There was a lot more evidence, just like in the Socorro landing case. They had, the physical evidence and footprints and things that a lot of cases don't have. Well, come to find out, the Snippy case is very similar in a lot of physical kind of evidence that was left there. And one of those were these indentations in the grounds, and they took the castings and they took it to Socorro, to Lonnie Zamora, and they were comparing the castings. Now, they're quite different in depth and in size, but some similarities, but not exact. So can you speak how important history is, and what can we do as investigators and researchers? You mentioned it's important to go talk to the people face to face, to visit the locations, but what can we do to preserve and to get those historical cases out there and continue to make connections? It's not too late.
No, it's not too late. You can go back to, as we saw in Argentina, you can go back to, and some of those witnesses will tell you, yes, at the time they had one experience, but somehow it also opens up certain things in the mind that you're now attuned to capturing some things that the rest of us might not think are relevant. And I have, in talking to Juan again, and again and again. I mean, it wasn't just one conversation. We had several conversations there for several days. We're all living together in a hacienda that was rented for the whole team, and there are pictures of that in the book. And there, one of the people there is a psychiatrist from Argentina who's done a lot of regression work with Juan, and he was part of our team. And of course, after a few days, we all became friends, and we talked about, all the other cases, so on. And that's where you begin to get an appreciation for all the elements you have to bring into the investigation. It's not so in Socorro, and I'm delighted that the APRO case has been preserved because of course they were reasonably close to it geographically, and they were all over the case. There were 5 agencies of the U.S. government or law enforcement involved in the Socorro case. But what I found in going through the records again, and the file is going to go to Rice University, where that's part of the 54 boxes that I've donated to Jeff Kripal and his team. But there is testimony that has never seen the light of day. Mm. One of them is a man who just came in casually from the base, from White Sands. And he approached Dr. Hynek, and Dr. Hynek was back at the site, looking at the site, and the two of them were pacing the area of this part of the desert. And Dr. Hynek was saying, well, it was probably something with like an exhaust, because people had described this blue light under the egg-shaped object. It made a lot of noise, and it went up, and Lonnie Zamora saw it go up. He was terrified. He lost his glasses, and the thing just stopped moving. It was just hanging there, silent, and then it went off across the desert. When it got up, there was a little flame, funnel-shaped blue flame under the big egg, which, by the way, is the same shape and approximately the same size as the one at Trinity and the one at Valensol. And everybody, all the designers, who were brought in to illustrate books about it, have driven those objects as saucers. And they are not saucers. All 3 are egg-shaped, approximately the same size. And we know the sizes, and we know the weights. Okay? A lot of it is known. You don't need to wait for a breakthrough physics theory, that will unify everything in the cosmos. We know the prints in the ground. It has been tested. It has to be measured. It has been measured at Valensol, has been measured at Socorro. And the man who came casually from the base was with Dr. Hynek. And he said, Dr. Hynek, you're an astronomer. What do you know about markings and traces on the ground? Let me show you something. And there was an old newspaper, actually an old piece of cardboard. I've gone back there with the son of Dr. Hynek several times. It's littered with stuff. and there was a cardboard, part of a cardboard box. And he lifted the box and he showed Dr. Hynek the grass underneath was green. You know, it wasn't singed by anything. There was no effect of either radiation or heat or flames. And the box hadn't moved. As the thing took off a few feet away from it, okay, they were at the site itself. He said, how would that happen if it had a propulsive engine? You know, he said, I'm the expert from White Sands, you know, on traces in, you know, accidents with missiles and other craft that we launched from White Sands is a test base, you know, for rockets. Well, this wasn't done by a rocket. This wasn't done by something with an exhaust. That blue flame they saw was a flame, but it didn't singe the grass and it didn't blow up this piece of cardboard, which was 5 feet from it. How do you explain that?
Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
Dr. Hynek, you know, that's in one of his reports. You know, Dr. Hynek was struck by that. There was another expert, and his testimony is in, you know, in Trinity, in the book that I wrote with Paula. It's never been published before, and it clinches the whole thing. This man is a distinguished, has been at war, highly decorated. He's now he's an engineer. He's head of the motor pool for White Sands. White Sands is enormous, you know, and he's in charge of keeping all the vehicles, you know, working in good condition, because otherwise people get lost in the desert and you have to send helicopters to pick them up and so on. And so it's a big problem. So yeah, they maintain a motor pool, you know, with very, you know, he's very strict in what he does. He's driving home across White Sands with his 2 kids and his wife in a vehicle, you know, sort of a small truck from the motor pool. There is a light in the sky, in over the mountains, in the direction. Of course, he's heard of Socorro. He's followed the whole thing. This is the evening after. He knows the object has taken off over the range and over the Trinity area, and it's going off towards Mexico. And he sees that light in the sky, and the light gets bigger. He keeps driving in the desert. His car dies. He gets on the radio to report it to his base. The radio is dead. Okay. Now, this is the expert on all the vehicles on the base with his family at night. He's dead in the middle of the desert. The thing seems to be getting closer and closer. It becomes a big light. They all see it. And then it recedes in the same direction. So we don't know. And of course, a physicist would say, Jacques, you know, you're making up the story because you don't know if it really moved towards them or if the object just, the light expanded without the object moving, or if it came close and then the light looked bigger. So, okay, so we don't know that. But the car was dead. And this is not the testimony you can challenge in court because you're not going to get anywhere. So the light recedes and he turns the key and the radio comes on and the engine comes on. And when he got back, you know, after the weekend, he got back to his base. He got his team together and he said, you're going to take my truck and you're going to take it apart. I want to see all the parts on the floor, labeled every single screw. Okay, I want you to tell me what happened to my truck, and let's test it and let's see if we can figure out if there is anything changed about it, if there is something that's broken in the electrical conductors, anything burned, and any wire that got disconnected, and so on. There was nothing wrong with the truck.
Hmm.
And that's the shop that maintains all the vehicles at White Sands. Okay, we got that testimony and it's published in our book. Okay, it's the only place where it's been published. Shouldn't people know that? Okay, shouldn't that be okay? Forget Trinity if you don't like Trinity. Okay, so two kids. Who knows about the two kids? Well, those were remarkable kids.
Hmm.
Remarkable enough that one of them would climb the tower that was disabled that evening by something that hit, something like 30 feet up from the ground. And they climbed the tower to see exactly which direction the thing came. Okay. I mean, those kids were clever. They were taking care of the cattle. This is the middle of, well, it was really the end of the war, but all the able-bodied men were still in Germany or France or, in occupied Europe. And they hadn't been brought back yet. They were still in uniform. The kids were taking care of everything. The kids had binoculars. What kind of binoculars? Kid binoculars? No, they were, they were big binoculars. Said, why, as a young kid, why would you need binoculars? Well, we were on our horses and we had to read the markings on the cattle that was, half a mile away. Because there was cattle from other ranches that came through the fence, and we had to return the cattle. Well, all that makes sense. Of course, they would have good binoculars, and they knew how to use it. And they followed all the recovery with those binoculars, hidden in the bushes, because they knew the territory, and the young army guys couldn't care less. They were just doing a job, recovering the craft. Those things happened, But in the same book, you have the thing about Trinity and the thing about Valençol. The reason Valençol is unique is that, again, the witness, it's a single witness case. If you take it at face value, who is the witness? Well, he is a man, in his 30s or 40s. He's a farmer. He was a very young man during the resistance. This is an area in the Alps where there was a lot of heavy fighting against the armored divisions of the Germans. And he was one of the partisans in the, in the mountains. And so when he talks to the cops, when he talks to the gendarmes, they are very respectful of him because he was, part of the resistance during the war in that area. He knows the area very well. He owns a number of fields. His crop is expensive. It's a specialty crop for perfumes. This is not just hay for the cattle. And what he saw, he was paralyzed. He had a number of effects, some of which he didn't talk to the cops about it because he wanted to see if the two creatures he had seen would come back. And by the way, those creatures were small men. They were breathing air. What kind of an astronaut breathes air when he is on a foreign planet? Okay. At Trinity, the three entities were breathing the air. They had two eyes, they had a small nose, they had a small mouth, but they were humanoid. At Socorro, there were two entities. They were breathing air. So at the end of the day, you had 7 in that book. We reported on 3 cases where there were 7 entities that were the size of a kid, 3.5 feet tall, breathing air with 2 eyes, with expressions on their faces that the witnesses could recognize as human expressions. There were other things, in all 3 cases, they report perhaps, psychic impressions when the entities were looking at them. Powerful psychic impressions in their brains. They report a form of communication. Well, the Air Force wasn't interested in that. I'm interested in that. This is, all the research done in parapsychology tells us that there is a whole range of phenomena on that side of the perception. Yeah, it's not recorded by an instrument that we can calibrate in the lab, but it's there. And it's there in all 3 cases, with 7 entities that are similar biologically and with objects that seem to have the same kind of propulsion, which we don't understand in terms of physics, even today. So there we are. That's the problem.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's just such a model of how we can still find new information to these old cases. And I wonder if they tested the roots, because in the Snippy case and one other case in folklore, there were singed and burned roots, but the top was not burned. So that cardboard box and not seeing the singeing, I wonder if they went underground and tested the roots. That would be interesting to find
we
out.
have another case in France that I've studied where actually the French project gave me some of the residue to test in an American lab. So when they talk in Congress about confiscating or all the samples and giving it to a government lab, they may think that, yes, we need to compare the analysis across cases, but what about the censorship? I mean, how do we know? I mean, no scientist would trust, the National Bureau of Standards telling you it's pure aluminum. Nobody will trust that anymore. If they've read my books, they should not trust it.
Yeah.
And Congress is going there, contemplating, laws like that come out of nowhere. We've been sharing these with Dr. Sturrock, Professor Sturrock at Stanford was testing the cases from Brazil. They donated the cases. I was in Argentina. There was some residue from the Brazilian case. They gave me the tubes with the residue, and I brought it back to Stanford. When Professor Stewart died, knew that he was dying, he donated to me all his samples. Well, some of them went to other groups, but I have some of the essential samples from the Brazilian case to compare with the new ones we have. If we don't do that, we're not going to do science. We're just going to do things in the basement that will always be subject to to scrutiny and to malfeasance of one kind or another.
Right. That chain of custody is so important.
Yeah.
Hugely important. Michael.
Yeah, so you mentioned consciousness and other psi elements of the phenomena, and one of the driving questions that I have in approaching all this is this really large question of like how do I understand what I am and what the world is, and how to be at home in the world and live well and gloriously. That's kind of like the I need some end result to that for anything to be fundamentally interesting to me. And it seems like there's a lot of material here in the study of the strange that has implications for those really large existential or religious or spiritual questions. And I wonder, as you've had a whole lifelong career studying very strange things and sort of facts that lie at the fringes of our understanding, it seems like those questions motivate you also. And if you, as you reflect on all that you've done, is there a way of kind of summarizing or characterizing the conclusions that you've come to that sit at that like existential level of like how to be a human? And maybe I'm asking sort of about spiritual practice as one way to frame it, or something, or what we are, or how to live well.
I was amused the other day after an interview like that. There were some remarks on the internet saying that actually one man took me to court. Saying, Dr. Vallée, you're not even religious. I mean, you're not even a Christian.
Hmm.
Well, there are many definitions for what it is to be a Christian, okay, and to many ways to be religious. I think and some people said you're interested, in the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucians were not Christian. Well, the Rosicrucians came out of course, of the Protestant religion in Switzerland and in Germany. And that was the root of the Rosicrucian movement, because as opposed to the Catholic tradition, which tends to say that science, has to bow to religion because God has made the world and we need to admire it, but we shouldn't open a human body. We shouldn't do experiments to investigate things because if God had wanted us to know that, he would have told us. Well, the Protestant tradition was much more of a scientific tradition, certainly with Luther, and in fact, the Rosicrucian tradition came out of Luther's, religious tradition in Switzerland and the extension in the German-speaking world and then worldwide, and it's very much impressed in the worship of nature, as nature being something which reaches into the divine. Okay, and there, I had that discussion once with a lady who actually had a home in Valençol, and she's the one who invited me to Valençol because she knew the witnesses and so on. And we had that discussion about the religious. And I said, people think that I'm not religious. And she says, of course, you're not dealing with religion. You're dealing with the divine.
Mm.
And people don't make that distinction, that when you take the frontiers of physics, you get to the divine. That doesn't mean that you have to believe in a particular historical series of books that somebody wrote that are accepted as being religious texts, and they are important. They are very important, and they read on, parts of nature that we now study with physics and medicine, biology, and so on. But that's not the divine. And when you get to some extreme cases like the ones we've talked about, and when you're in the presence some of the witnesses, you get to that level very quickly once you've disposed of, the physics, who was there, the pictures, and everything else. You get to that level, and that's a level where, I've made no secret that I was fascinated with that I was, with very humbly, you know, I've tried to be trained in some of these traditions, and then at some point you have to let go of the books and the writing is. It's important to be surrounded with all those books, and here in San Francisco, I have the books of Paracelsus, and I can even read some of it. And I have good translations, and but I have books from spiritual leaders who didn't agree with Paracelsus, and modern people who are redoing that kind of quest. Um, one of the very striking series of books come from the one time one of the one of the researchers in this field, a woman whose name you'd recognize, who has published on from the point of view of religion about UFOs, was going through my library, and I have a big book called Satan, now on the spine. It says Satan. And she says, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a compendium of studies about Satanism that was published by an order of nuns in France." Those nuns thought that after World War II, we didn't know enough about Satanism and that side, the dark side of things. And they published that book either during the war or right after the war. It was a book by a number of scholars they had brought in. It's a Carmelite order of nuns.
Mhm.
The Carmelites are scholars.
Yeah,
They
they're
are,
an academic order. Yeah.
yeah, they are highly respected in academia. They've published two books that are relevant here. One is a book about Satan, and the book has 666 pages. So it shows that these women were not afraid of what they were writing about. They took it seriously, but they also had a little sense of humor,
Yeah.
as does the devil, of course. I mean, the devil gets us through his sense of humor sometimes. And we misunderstand that. And just like we misunderstand the humor in some of the UFO encounters,
Mhm.
the dialogue with the entities, when there's a dialogue, sometimes it's purely telepathic and so on. Sometimes it's in English or in French. Going back to the 19th century, we have those cases that we think, we can prove they happened, but they don't make sense. Well, they don't make sense because they are using language in a way that is like a super language, And of course, in software development, we have super languages, behind Fortran or behind, C++. There is a super language that generated the language you use on the computer.
Computer language, you mean? Yeah, the
Yes,
very low
and
level.
meta languages.
Yeah.
And it's a special art, if you want, special, uh, but it's very interesting, and that's what we seem to be touching, and that's what takes us into the religious. And of course, Jeffrey Skripal has had a lot to say about that at Rice University, and that's why he has all my archives, and that, as you may know, inspired other people like Whitley Strieber and others to donate their archives, and Dr. Haynes, Richard Haynes, so on. So now there are 10 archives that that are being indexed now at Rice by the School of Religion, by the Department of Religion.
Yeah.
And that's very important because that can be all of us, who donated those archives wanted to go beyond the ufology side, the testimony itself, which I'm delighted that it's preserved at several places in the US and a few places elsewhere. But that aspect that you're asking about, that's going to be at Rice. And, John Mack archives have been donated, in the last couple of years. And now it's creating an attractor, a great attractor to other archives that read on the same problem of good and evil, and is it a threat? Is it the end of mankind? Is it something that will only communicate with our AI languages or our AI entities? And a few of us have started to speculate about is the dialogue to be engaged between our AI software and the UFO software, if you will, and leaving us out of the dialogue. Is that what they are looking for? Somebody to talk to, finally,
You know what?
in the computer.
And you
Well,
know
I
what?
hope not.
Yeah.
I'd
Me
like to
too.
be maybe not part of a dialogue, but I'd like to sit in the front row and listen to what they have to say.
When it comes down to the telepathy, it's weird because it seems like all these entities are capable of it. We are able to listen. We maybe talk back, but only in their presence. And we often debate as whether or not we had this ability before and we've lost it. Because in our past, we know something happened that messed us up. Now, this is weird, but I'm going to bring up the Bible with the telepathy things. In the Bible, it talks about the Tower of Babel. Now, back then, all men were able to communicate and understand each other. Once they built Babel and it got destroyed, it says men were no longer able to understand one another or communicate. All men. So then languages formed all over because we had to use language. We weren't able to use telepathy before. So to me, it seems like this is something that's innate. It's built in us, but it's not activated. And whenever they show up, they're like, well, you have it. So, it's like a radio transmitter. But my question, which leads me to my final question for you, Jacques, is it possible that this phenomenon, even though it interacts with us physically, is here because of the spiritual aspect? That this realm we think is the end all be all is not. It's just it's a different project. Maybe we're from a different place that higher. I mean, this is coming more and more common in our community that maybe we're bigger than what we think we are, and that the physicalness or whatever their interactions with us has nothing really to do physically, but more spiritually.
Um, well, in I mean, obviously, you're really touching two questions. One is, can we do a better job of, I would reframe it in this way. Can we do a better job when we're facing a witness like Juan or others by going into those other levels? And as you know, I try to do that, but I try to do it from my own personal experience with the phenomenon itself, and with others who've trained me to be attuned to certain words or certain things. So, but the of course, now we're opening that up. Certainly, all the work that we did with the Bigelow project, especially with NIDS, had that very much in the context. They were both in the advisory board and the staff, people who had actually done experiments and were knew a lot about parapsychology. They knew a lot about the extremes of the body, and that was very much in play in everything that the team did as a team. Uh, but there is another level, which is, how much do we know about ourselves, in that even if once we become convinced that, yes, thought can be transmitted, yes, you can do these experiments, yes, you can lift objects by thought or by certain types of attention placing, and but what else is there? So I had occasion in venture capital, I investigated one company that was doing was building a very special type of component that would be used by labs that were developing psychiatric drugs that would change, that would affect uh, different types of brain problems and so on, and help in finding a cure for that, both in the hospital and also drugs given, generally authorized to the population, to patients. And these people were developing from a very special biological material, uh, on which they could test different things and discover different types of triggers for the mind.
Mm.
So I spoke to them about the business and so on, and the business was remarkable. And it turned out every pharmaceutical company needed them, and they were unique with that capability in their labs and in their computers, because it came from supercomputers. And I was fascinated with that, and we decided to actually invest in the company, which did very well, went public, and but the name wouldn't really mean anything. But then I went back to talk to the chemists, and since we were going to write a check, they were eager to talk to us as much as we could, as on both sides. So I said, look, I'm really not a financial guy. I'm really a scientist. I don't know pharmacology, but just how many of those triggers are there in the brain? Like, to talk about serotonin, you talk about dopamine that you're going to test for, and of course you're going to test for subtypes, because the pill they give you could have opposite effect in me than it does in you, the same pill.
Mm.
And the science says, well, that's the shape of the molecule, okay? Well, yeah, it's the shape of a molecule, but there are other shapes that are very similar. So how many variants are there? Well, they said, well, we know of 14 subtypes, many of which have never been published because we haven't had time to write a paper. And I said, well, are those chemicals just in the brain? They said, no, they are, people think it's just in the brain, but it's everywhere. There are centers in the body, certainly the sex organs, certainly the heart, and a few other places that we haven't discovered where they can be created, and they flood your body. And that may be one of the explanations for miracles at Lourdes. Some of the miracles at Lourdes are cancers where the person was told, we cannot do anything more with you. You're very religious. You can go to Lourdes if you wanted, and they have a crisis in the middle of the night. They see all kinds of things in the middle of the night, and the next day the cancer is gone. Okay, I mean, those cases have been documented by teams of doctors. Well, that could happen if one of those chemicals or a combination of chemicals is in the body and gets triggered by certain conditions that are psychic conditions. Okay. Of course, there is a religious angle, but there is a biology angle that is right in front of you. And I found that, so I said, well, how many of those chemicals are there? And he laughed and he said, this was a young biologist. And he said, well, if you had gone to medical school, Dr. Vallée, they would have told you about 15 of those cases that you would have had to study for the exam. I said, no, my question was, how many are there? He said, we know of about 200 or 300, but there are probably thousands, and we don't know where the teams are going to come from to study them, in the next 20 years, because we discover them. We work very hard here, but we work for a pharmaceutical company on a contract to discover a new type of, of chemical for the brain that will do something like Prozac, except we need to address a subtype of the of the chemical structure that today's Prozac doesn't address. And it's a big problem, and they buy what we give them. But we come back on weekends and we look at the genome, and we look at parts of the genome that nobody's looking at that might be coding for other chemicals, for other molecules, like serotonin, like dopamine, and we find them, and we don't know what they do, and we don't have the time or the staff to investigate what they do, but we could produce, the test chemicals that you could take to the lab to find out what those do. And they are generating by glands or by structures throughout the body that can flood the bloodstream in a second with something that will have a massive effect, just like dopamine or serotonin or others, the fight and flight reaction when you're confronted with, with a wolf, coming at you, the fight or flee reaction. Those reactions bypass the brain, okay? And they are instant, and they involve the entire body. And those things, they say, we laugh, and when you see, people experimenting with LSD. Well, yeah, LSD is a drug in the body. It's generated by the body, and you can do it in the lab. But it's one of thousands of drugs like that, and just concentrating on a few of them is a joke. This is where that part of the science is going to go. So when somebody is confronted with whatever it is that we call a UFO or UAP, how do we know what it's linking to in our organism that may reveal itself in time, or it may reveal itself instantly? That's what, that's where people are reinterpreting some miracles. How are people cured instantly of something? Is that really true? Well, in most cases, it's not true. Then, the malady was misdiagnosed or something. But in dozens of cases, it is true. Something happened from an exterior physical interaction. And that's one more reason to study UFOs and to talk to these witnesses. But you can't do it by staying in Washington. No. Yeah, you have to get out, and you have to forget your clearance. And there is no clearance for that. It's a a PhD in microbiology will get you there, but the clearance isn't.
And you bring up some good points too about, the chemicals in the body. And if these entities have been watching us for eons, they know everything about us, every, chemical compound, everything, that they would know everything. So it's easy for them to be able to manipulate a witness or something because they know how it works. They know how the brain works. Even we hear about these healings like Susan Alloway that had her appendix removed and her ovary that had cancer removed from an entity or entities during her trip. It's crazy. But we hear about these healings that these entities do. Then we hear about healings that people in religious practices do. So it is connected somehow. We just can't see the big picture. We're part of the puzzle. We can't see the overall puzzle, right? This book is fantastic. There's so much to it that we can't get into everything. Obviously, I tabbed everything I want to talk about, but there's no way we can do it. It's Forbidden Science 6. Of course, we're going to add the link to this book in the descriptions as well. Jacques, as much as you're a phenomenal investigator and an absolute legend, right? But you're also a very awesome author. You've written a lot of books, and I've enjoyed every single one. Some of them in the back, they're very heavy. They're hard to get into, or they use big words, or the way they frame their sentences doesn't make sense. Every single one of your books makes sense, and it hits close to home. And the more I read it, the more I understand that I know nothing, and that more this stupid field that we're in is even more elusive than it ever has been for me before. But this is phenomenal, and I think the volumes that you've created together as a whole. I think anybody who's getting into ufology, if anybody's listening to this, you just got into it, or maybe you haven't read anything. The Jacques Vallees are a necessity in your library, because if I show up at your house and I don't see Jacques Vallée on your shelves, you're not a true ufologist, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, exactly. But seriously, we owe you all such a great debt of gratitude. And we said that too for George Knapp. I mean, you guys are the pioneers. You guys took the punches. You were in a ring swinging back when all of us were sitting on the sidelines. But that's changing, and that's because of you guys. So the contribution that you've made is huge. You've affected all three of us at some point in our lives. We met your work, and it changed us. And I know it's hard because you're a very humble person, but be very happy about the influence that you've had on so many people that you'll never get to meet, but you've had influence on them. So that is not something we can all say at the end of our lives, right? Okay, so Forbidden Science, A Scattered Castle. Jacques, do you have anything coming up or anything you want to promote to the audience?
I think that Trinity, the book I wrote with Paola, has been unjustly pushed aside. And it's been pushed aside because first we self-published it. We didn't want to go through a publisher. We tried some things and it didn't make sense. But it's probably, in a way, if I look at it strictly as a contribution to getting close to the real problem, it's probably my best book.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it's my best book because I had help from Paola, who had done 4 years of work before I got involved, before she brought me into the case. But, I added the Socorro and the Valençol part to it. I think, it leaves a lot of things open. We didn't have all the answers. We had many of the questions, and I think that's what's important.
Yeah. And it's related to Roswell. I mean, it happened very close to it 2 years prior. Then Socorro is just northwest, I want to say, of
And
that. So
Socorro
it's,
is about 8 miles straight north.
yeah. So three locations, three incidences within, the 10-year gap. It's crazy. 45, 47, and was it 63?
60,
Or
65.
okay, yeah.
August
So
1st, 65.
obviously they're
In,
interested
in,
in that
in,
area,
in the
whether
Alps.
yeah. So it's either the radio or radioactive materials they're looking for in that vicinity, or they're aware of what was there. But either way, we know that nukes attract them. I would love to have you back on, Jacques, because seriously, we could talk another 5 hours with you, not a problem. And to me, it's like story time, right? It's just like get to listen to.
Wasn't this supposed to be 1 hour?
What's that? Usually,
Well,
yeah, but with you, no
well,
problem. Yeah, you 2 hours, no
I
problem.
have a clock here at the on the side of my screen.
Good thing you don't
No,
charge by
it
the
was
hour. We couldn't
lovely.
afford
Well,
it.
thank you for your
Thank you so much for being here.
questions. I know you have other things you wanted to talk about we didn't get to, but
We'll get to them.
maybe some other time.
Oh, I
Yeah.
would love to reschedule you back on for sure. There's so much we could ask and learn from you for sure. Katie, Michael, anything you want to say before we go?
I just want to
Just a
say
huge
thank you.
thank you. Yeah, it's a huge thank you.
Are you paying attention?